York, and trying to change U.S. policy toward Yemen. One of many fasts and actions that she's done over the years. As many of you know, Kathy has been to Middle East countries a number of times, right in the middle of war zones, living with people, going through these horrendous wars. She maintains contact with people in Afghanistan today. So not only does Kathy do the stuff that most of us would never dare to do, but she is, in addition, she is a source of information for us. She is an expert on a lot of these issues. So she brings together the activism that is so important to changing policy with an understanding of the actual political, social developments in these areas. So this is why we're just very, very fortunate tonight to have Kathy here during her tour. Thank you.
Well, I was looking forward to this chance to be with you here tonight. And Claire, and those of you who are walking, I just think there's probably an incalculable number of people who've drawn energy and faith just from the step-by-step sturdiness and encouragement and steadiness of your witness. So please know that we come together tonight with great gratitude and deep gratitude for what you've represented. For me, it was a very compelling moment to be across from the Kings Bay nuclear naval station with three of the people from your order, Denise and Utsumi and
was it June-san?
no, my goodness, how can I forget his name? Senji. And to see those three people banging the drum in the hot sun and knowing what the nuclear weapons had done to Japan, certainly, I think, helped us all understand why some of our friends, three of them, are still now almost a year in the Glynn County Jail. Megan, I know there's Megan Rice, who has certainly been somebody who's been a guiding light of the Plowshares' actions, and four are out, wearing ankle bracelets, leg irons really, awaiting trial. So it's a very dramatic time. Our friend Steve Kelly is a Jesuit priest, and he can only write postcards that are pre-stamped government-issued postcards, and that's all you can send in to them also. So Megan and I were just saying he fills the postcard with this scribble you can barely read, and the first half of it is all his blessings for us. But for me, he has an odd cartography. He writes to me as Kathy of Kellydom. We're no relation, but in his view, he doesn't really pay any attention to the borders that people presume are the real deal. He's got all these different places where the activists and the communities exist, and that's how he sees the basis of power, if you will, in our world. He really is that way. And so I'm always very, very pleased to hear from him. But I think increasingly, in my own experiences, I also don't want to be obeisant to the borders that are drawn by people who have basically been involved in a great deal of thieving, of stealing, of plunder, of pillaging. You know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talked about the whole Jericho Road and exhorted us to try to reach that time where no person, no man, woman, or child would be at risk of being assaulted or killed on that very, very dangerous road. It actually is a very dangerous road between Jerusalem and Jericho. And so we have a huge responsibility in our time right now to the future generations and to the people now most at risk. So I'd like to start by recalling what to me is kind of a fueling memory. It's good for me to go back to this. I had been a young teacher on the streets of Chicago, teaching kids from the Harrison Gents and the Latin Kings, and in fact, sometimes my students didn't survive their own teenage years. And a number of us in the Midwest decided we can't just go along with this like it's normal. And somehow what got into our minds over a year of preparation and retreats and thinking together was that we should plant corn on top of nuclear missile silo sites, because so much money was going into building up the nuclear weapons industry, and in our own inner cities there was nothing available for meeting most basic human needs. So on the day that we were planting the corn on top of intercontinental ballistic missiles, my heart was thudding because I looked at the coiled fence and the barbed wire on top of it, and I thought, what if I don't make it over the fence? My friend had dropped me off and sped off, and I knew that other friends were doing the same thing elsewhere in the missile silo fields of Missouri, but I was one nervous cookie. And so I got to the other side, and I had 6 pellets of pink corn, and Ernest Bromley, one of Massachusetts' finest peace activists, blind though he was, had taught me how to plant the corn. So I thought, well, I just better do my best, and I had a tablespoon, and I planted my 6 pellets of pink corn. And then I wasn't quite sure what to do. I hung 2 banners, disarm and live, farms not arms, and then I sat down on the lid of this intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile, and I started to notice that the crickets were creaking, and the birds were chirping, and the mist was rising up. It was a beautiful morning, and I calmed down. And then I saw a vehicle speeding down the country road, and it had a machine gun mounted on top, and I thought, that's for me. And it skidded to a stop, a little gravel and pebbles, and 4 men climbed out in full military garb, camouflage, helmets, walkie-talkies, rifles, and one of them said into the walkie-talkie, crouched down, all personnel, please clear the site. Well, I was going to do whatever they said, step to the left, step to the right, and they had the key, so they opened the fence. I didn't have to climb back out. And then I was handcuffed, and then 3 of them took off, gone. I don't know, maybe they had to check the manual to see what do you do next, but they left one fellow with me, and he had his gun, I mean, not at my head, but aimed at me. And now, well, I never turned around, so I can't really tell you what happened next. But I probably lasted about 1.5 minutes in silence. I'm sort of preternaturally extroverted. And after my 1.5 minutes in silence, I started talking. And I told him all kind of, why we did what we did and how I hoped it would help children in his life as well as children in the Soviet Union. And then I asked him, do you think the corn will grow? And he said, I don't know, ma'am, but I sure hope so. So I said, would you like to say a prayer? Yes, ma'am. So I launched into the St. Francis Peace Prayer. Lord, make me a channel of your peace. Where there is darkness, let me sow light. Where there is sadness, joy. Where there is despair, hope. O Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be pardoned as to pardon, to be loved as to love with all my soul. And he said, amen. And then he asked me, ma'am, would you like a drink of water? I said, oh, yes, please. And then he said, ma'am, please tip your head back. And I can still feel the water dribbling down my chin. Now, like I said, I didn't turn around, but I know I saw 2 hands squeezing the canteen as that young man poured water down ma'am's throat. And he couldn't have had the 2 hands on the canteen and the gun, so he either put it down or let it lie on a strap. But I think he might have been breaking a rule. At any rate, I think he took a risk to do an act of kindness for a complete stranger. I had to seem pretty strange. But I want to tarry with his question to me. Would you like a drink of water? We're standing on top of a nuclear bomb. His job is to protect it. Instead, he cares just a little bit more about giving someone a drink of water. Well, can you imagine if we, my dear friends, could say to the children of Yemen, would you like a drink of water? Children at risk of dying from starvation or cholera caused by contaminated water. Children at risk of dying of thirst. Imagine if we could say, no, we don't care about our weapons more than we care about you. We don't care about Raytheon or Boeing or General Dynamics or Lockheed. We care about you more. Would you like a drink of water? That's what means more to us. Or bring it closer to home. Imagine if we could say to children in Flint, Michigan, or in any of the areas of this country where infrastructure is failing people, would you like a drink of clean water? We don't care about the weapons makers more than we care about you. Or if we could say to the children and future generations, right now climate change and global warming are wreaking havoc in many parts of the planet. And I do want to talk about that more tonight. But even the children that are the grandchildren that you know in your lives are there, if we could say to them, would you like to have water? And we care more about that than the weapons. But as the United States military so skillfully markets and sells to us war after war after war, I know some of you in this room, you've tried your whole lives long to put an end to it. I know you sometimes feel like you're putting out a brush fire and you turn around and there's another one. And it's not like some crazy arsonist is starting all these fires. It's a planned, deliberate strategy on the part of a country whereas once people might have sold weapons to fight wars, we now have to create wars to sell the weapons. So what we face. I'd like to switch gears a bit. Once upon a time, the Sisters of St. Bridget of Kildare, Ireland, called me while I was in Baghdad, Iraq. And we had said, we're going to stay there. We're going to stay in Baghdad because we think the 2003 shock and awe bombing is certainly coming. And we can't wave our blue passports and saying it's kind of dangerous, we're getting out of here. So we stayed. And so they called and said, would I come over to Ireland? And I said, oh no, sisters, I can't. We're staying here in Baghdad. And they said, oh, Kathy, you're needed in Ireland now. And so I couldn't say no, it turned out. So I said, well, all right, I'll come and then I'll go back. So I went to Ireland and I gave a retreat and talked about the conditions of children in Iraq. And, I remember saying that a British nurse had joined us and he was in a hospital room and looked at the ward of cross-legged mothers holding their dying babies. And none of them would take those babies out of the hospital. The economic sanctions were punishing those children to death. And Martin Thomas said, this young nurse, I think I understand. It's a death row for infants, isn't it? And that was true. And I remember saying that and leaving large laminated pictures of some of the most beautiful children in the world with my young Irish friends. And I went back to Baghdad. And after I was back there, maybe about a week, I learned that 5 people had gone out on the tarmac of Shannon Airport and did $2.5 million worth of damage to a United States Navy warplane parked on there. I didn't tell them to do it, but I did become their witness at a trial that lasted 3 years. It's on my mind very much because 2 very wonderful vets for peace, Ken Myers and Tarek Kaf, are now in the Limerick prison because they cut the fence at Shannon Airport and they went out to investigate a United States military contractor plane, an Omni airplane, that's doing a pit stop and helping facilitate the transport of soldiers and equipment and maybe weapons into the Middle East where United States soldiers are fighting, and Ireland's a neutral country. So anyway, the Sisters of St. Bridget called me more recently, and they said, it's a 10-year anniversary of that action that I described with the warplane. By the way, those 5 were acquitted on all 5 counts because of the necessity defense. And while we're thinking of applause, at the Raytheon factory in Derry, Ireland, the next year, learning that Raytheon was responsible for creating a bunker buster bomb that had been used in many places. The Israelis had just used it in Lebanon. Northern Irish activists went into the Raytheon plant in Derry, opened up the windows, unplugged the computers, dropped them out the window, crash, 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 crash. And they were acquitted on all 5 counts. If you can get that necessity defense, that you did what you did to prevent a greater harm, it can mean a great deal. So the sisters invited me to come over to Ireland, and then they said, but Kathy, could you meet us in a field, please? I said, oh, okay. And they said, you'll meet the De La Salle boys, they're high school boys, and there's a field we want you to. And so they told me how to get to this field. I said, okay. And we were all kind of curious, especially these high school kids. It's wet out there, and their feet are pretty soon soaking wet, and they're kind of snickering with each other, what's this? But then along came Danny Cusack, the historian for the local area. And he pointed to this rather imposing big building next to the field. And he said, that, my friends, was the Dunschlagen workhouse. And those who went to the workhouse were terrified that they would never come out alive, and most didn't. They went to the workhouse because their families had run out of food, and there wasn't any work, and they were close to starving. And so they could go and find a place to stay and to work. But there was typhus and disease in the workhouse. Behind the workhouse, there was a big field, and it was actually a mass grave for unidentified bodies. But Danny Cusack read off the names of the Irish people who most likely had died in the Dunschlagen workhouse. And of course, the names are very similar to the names of the boys from De La Salle High School, and nobody's snickering any longer. And then Danny Cusack told us that 1 million people had died in the Great Famine in Ireland. 1.5 million had come to places like the United States or New Zealand or Australia, had left as migrants. And of course, now in the United States today, people with last names very similar to mine are saying, send them back. Send them back. If it was, a time change, they would have been sending their own grandmothers and grandfathers back to famine-ridden Ireland. But the reason that's been on my mind so much is because I did some research recently and learned that during that same time period, some would call it the late Victorian era, we're talking about the second half of the 1800s, when 1 million people died of famine in Ireland, El Nino effects and drought and climate changes contributed to the deaths of at least 20 million and possibly 50 million people living in the Maghreb, in Brazil, in northern China, and in India. Can you imagine 20 to 50 million people dying of starvation? And the similarity between what happened in Ireland and what happened in that late Victorian Holocaust, as some call it, was that the colonizers did have the transport systems and the wherewithal to get food to the starving people and chose instead to export it. And so those many, many millions of families suffering, bereavement, loss, grief. Imagine also the displacement and the difficulties in getting started again. But the reason I was even reading about this is because it's happening again. Maybe it won't be at that proportion, but in Yemen, 14 million people are on the brink of starvation. Now here's something that is almost impossible to wrap our minds around, I think. In 2016, the United States took in 80,000 people seeking refuge. Now we're down to 30,000. That same year, 117,000 people were admitted into Yemen seeking refuge. By that time, they're 1 year into this terrible escalation of war and conflict because the Saudis have been bombing the daylights out of them, starting with a sewage and sanitation facility, and the very next day an electrical facility, and then bombing the fisheries, and bombing the roadways, bombing the mosques, bombing the schools, even bombing the hospitals. And yet the refugees keep pouring in. The next year, 150,000 refugees. Why are people going to war-torn Yemen? Because the conditions are so desperate in the Horn of Africa. Another example, if you will, of that desperation. The terrible fighting in Sudan, and these Janjaweed fighters were some very fearsome and, terrifying warriors. Well, don't think that the Saudis fighting this war against Yemen have Saudi soldiers on the ground. And so people are so desperate in Sudan that they are paying a going rate of $1,000 to $1,031 as a bribe in order to get their kids, their teenagers, further up the list to be taken in as militias that will do the fighting in Yemen. Most of it is being organized by these Janjaweed soldiers, and some of them are, very seasoned warriors. But also the New York Times printed a story December of 2018 saying that the estimate is 20 to 40% of the Sudanese and African fighters in Yemen are children. I mean, think about it. Here in the United States, we've got celebrities, movie stars, people of great means paying little bribes or big bribes to get their kids into well-heeled elite schools. But imagine the contrast in Africa, where people have been afflicted by drought, by floods, and much of it caused because of northern industrial greenhouse gases, because of our practices. They're so desperate, they'll pay the $1,000, and God knows how they come across that, to get their kids into the risk of fighting in Yemen. I want to say something else about those migrations. It troubles me deeply to know that some people who are so desperate that they say, okay, maybe if I can get across the Red Sea, maybe I can get out of Yemen and go up into Saudi Arabia and I'll find a job, or I'll get beyond there, or one of the Gulf states. So they take these terrible risks and they have no idea what they're getting into. And sometimes they've gotten into boats and the boat sets sail and the smuggler in charge of the boat pulls out a gun and aims it at everybody on the boat and says, give us more money or we'll shoot. And sometimes people are so terrified the boat capsizes and people come ashore after they've drowned. But sometimes the boats get to the other side and then the unwitting people on the boat don't realize that now they're actually going to be put into a sort of black site detention center, and they'll be tortured until they give a phone number of somebody in Africa back home who will cough up some more money if they're ever to be. I mean, these are ghastly, horrible circumstances, but ghastly and horrible as those circumstances are, I guess I know that I in the United States have to look in the mirror and see what the United States is doing. The far greater danger, the far more ghastly cruelty happens when former Secretary of State Paul Ryan crosses over to Saudi Arabia, shakes hand, and makes the deal. We'll get you more weapons. When the president of this country goes over and with the Saudi princes in immaculate white robes, they place their hands on an orb and they dance together. That's a more dangerous crossing because the United States says, we'll give you the weapons. And so when the Saudis began involving themselves in Yemen, why ever in the world did the Saudis believe they should enter into that conflict? President Obama said to the Saudis, here's what we'll give you. And it's a very strange story because in a way, he wanted the Saudis to back off from criticizing the Obama administration for creating an agreement with Jawad Zarif. John Kerry negotiated in Iran. The Saudis were very, very angry about that. And to placate them in our strange world today, so full of weapons, the United States arranged for the Saudis to get cluster bombs, laser-guided missiles, 4 combat littoral ships, which were essential for creating the blockade, which was another exacerbation of hunger and disease and terrible conditions in Yemen. And then eventually, when 169 people were killed in a funeral in Sana'a, in the capital city of Yemen, President Obama said, you know what, we don't any longer have any faith in your ability to target people and avoid killing civilians. Well, they've been using United States surveillance to target plenty of people that weren't civilians. But Obama said, I'm going to cut off the flow of weapons. President Trump then said, oh, well, it's turned back on again. And so the good days for Raytheon, for Boeing, for General Dynamics, for Lockheed, to be able to continue that hideously dangerous flow of weapons. I just recently came from Afghanistan, and people are very, very afraid of civil war. And, you know, you can't say, oh, don't be so nervous. I mean, I fear that for them too. So I saw a United States Census Bureau chart that showed that in 2018, the United States sold $123 million worth of bullets to Afghanistan. And the previous year, they had sold 8 times less bullets. In other words, there was an 8-fold increase in the number of bullets the United States sold to Afghanistan. And if you look at all the other countries in the world, they don't come even close to receiving the number of bullets that the United States sold to Afghanistan. Why would any bullet manufacturers look at the globe and decide, oh, the place where we really can sell $123 million worth of bullets is Afghanistan? They must have expected that there's a good chance that people will take out guns and start shooting at each other. So is this a kind of a security that we're supposed to believe in? That somehow we're more secure if we arm the rest of the world and arm ourselves and dig ourselves deeper and deeper into an incapacity to meet our own problems here or meet problems elsewhere in the world. On a more positive note, we could do it all. We could eradicate world hunger, solve problems of disease. We could make sure that every person in the United States had adequate health care, that every person graduating from a United States university would never go forth with a debt, that we could do it all and then some. But of course we can't turn over $717 billion to the Pentagon as part of trillions of dollars that go to the Pentagon. Keep on building up our nuclear weapon capacity. We can't, there is no rational way to discuss solving the problems we face. Solving the problems of the greatest terror we face, which is what we're doing to our own environment. There's no rational way to discuss it without talking about dismantling this military-industrial complex. And so I think again about people in Yemen. One story that's been on my mind a great deal, thinking about water and giving people access to water. There was a town in Yemen called Avert. And, you know, some of these Yemenis just strike me as very, very sturdy people. They knew that the Yemeni government was not going to help them dig a well, which had to go deeper because the water table was lowering and they were desperate for water. And so they sort of formed their own collective and they managed to get together a well that would be sufficient to dig down deeper and deeper and deeper. And one guy in particular had sort of put some of his money in because he thought, well, this is a good deed to do. And they hit water. And on the very night that they hit water, and the whole town was celebrating, people were walking away from that celebration, and it's impossible to know why a Saudi warplane with what possible kind of surveillance had decided that this was the place to bomb, but suddenly a huge bomb was dropped on the town. Shards of the exploding bomb were flying through the air at 8 times the speed of sound. People were decapitated, people were maimed. It was a bloody, hideous mess, and in the middle of the night. And so when morning came, people were going out to the site of the attack. They wanted to see if they could help. They wanted to, some of them, look for missing relatives. People weren't able to grab their children before the kids went running out. 100 people at least had gathered, and then multiple warplanes came back, and they bombed for hours. They kept bombing and bombing. People who were there said it was as if they were running away and they were following them. And all of this was accomplished by missiles produced by Raytheon. And I know that Raytheon enjoys a pretty good reputation in an area where they sponsor the hunger walk. But oh my goodness, you know, the country of Yemen beset by famine. And what are we sending? Weapons and more weapons and more weapons. The bomb that hit the children on their field trip. Children on a field trip. You know what they're like. Some of you have been chaperones on buses with kids. You know, they're squirming and laughing and excited. And they were taking cell phone pictures of each other. Their teachers were in the bazaar getting picnic food because it was their reward. They each had a UNICEF blue backpack, which was just a prize because the UNICEF blue backpack is filled with vaccines and antibiotics and vitamins, so they're doing a favor for their families. They're so excited. And the bomb that was dropped on that bus, it was made by Lockheed Martin. And this is our export, bullets and bombs. And why is there war in Yemen? I want to say we should be very careful about being lulled into the idea that this is a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. I don't believe it. I believe we should take a cue from the Saudis having put Aramco, their oil company, up for an initial private offering, and the world investors, they weren't too interested. Because apparently it's become pretty well known amongst global finance big wigs that the Saudis have a lot of cash, but they really aren't doing so well in terms of resources. In fact, they might be hitting what's sometimes referred to as peak oil. Now, Yemen is certainly a beleaguered, battered, broken country. And it's been beleaguered, battered, and broken, but others who've been speculating and wanting to take their resources, but they have resources. Speculators believe that on the coastlines of Yemen, there are offshore oil resources that are extractable. There are fisheries, even though they've been very badly bombed of recent years. There are other minerals that could be under the ground in other parts of Yemen. The Bab el-Mandab is a very, very important port because it's kind of a chokehold for international trade. The Yemenis have resources, and I believe the Saudis are fearful. You know, Claire talked to us about fear, and we know from you that courage is the ability to control our fears. But I think that in the highest levels of the Saudi princes and royalty, they're afraid that they have to take resources in order to, quote, get by at the level they've grown accustomed to. And so there's Yemen. And it's a bit maybe like the manifest destiny that so guided the history of this country. Well, it's there, and we've got weapons, and we're big and strong, we just take it. And so I think that we're now watching the Saudis in collusion with other countries in that Saudi coalition, but very much supported by, encouraged by the United States, bludgeoning people in Yemen into submission. When I was a senior in college, I was so fortunate to hear Noam Chomsky come to talk at Loyola and Mundelein. And he said, in the United States, our message to the world has been that if you, as other countries, do not subordinate yourselves to serve our perceived national interest, we will eliminate you. It's a terrible, terrible message. It's almost like a demonic message. And the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke of the military being like a demonic suction cup, that it would take up our resources. And I believe we can sometimes almost feel mesmerized watching that. Like, how could we take action? But I also truly believe we catch courage from one another. Courage is the ability to control our fears. And I've seen it just so clearly in Afghanistan with teenagers. You know, I taught high school forever. I never thought that in my 60s, a group of 15 and 16-year-olds would be my main mentors in life. But here are these kids. And well, I'll tell you, I get pretty annoyed when I'm in Kabul and I look up and there is this big blimp with a camera mounted on its belly. There are actually 4 of them. And everywhere you look, this camera is spying on people in Kabul. Maybe it's turned off for all I know. But it's always that symbol. We can keep on feeding ourselves information about where you go and what you do. But there's another kind of surveillance that's going on in Kabul, and my young teenage friends are in charge of it. And this is what they do. They get spiral notepads and pens, and they go up the mountainside. There's not even a path, you know, and it's icy in the wintertime. And the reason they're going up, 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 higher and higher is because the widows get pushed up the mountain. They get pushed up the mountain because there's no water, and so the rent is a little bit cheaper. And there aren't any latrines, and so you can imagine. And then they go into the hovels. And I remember one time I was trying to keep up with them, and, well, I fainted. And so they had to sort of drop me off in the home of Khoreb. And Khoreb was shelling almonds just nonstop as she was with her other hand fixing me some tea to kind of make sure she didn't have to keep me all until the spring came. And she kept putting the almond shells in her little oven. It's called a bukhari. And that was her source of fuel, the almond shells. And then she'd bag up the almonds, and her son would quick go down the mountain to sell those at the marketplace. And she was a bit tearful as she got to know me better. She said the most things she wanted for her children was education. But she certainly couldn't afford that, and she needed the children to sometimes go into the market and look for scraps of potatoes and turnips so that they could survive. So my young friends have a survey. And the first question on the survey, their surveillance, asks, how many times a week does your family eat beans? And the second question asks, what is your source of water? How far do you have to go to get it? And the third question asks how much they pay for rent. And then the fourth question, so important, who is the main income earner for your family and how old is that person? And then they go back down the mountain and they put their surveys out on the floor. And the people who are dependent on somebody who's under 12 years of age go to the top of the pile, if you will. And they sort the surveys based on need. And that's the kind of surveillance that makes sense. And then they work it out. And this is so, so important. So that 30 Hazara women, and 30 Pashto women, and 30 Tajik women, not 31, they cut off at 30, that's so hard to do, are then invited to make big heavy blankets and be paid a wage to do it. And then those big heavy blankets are given free of charge to the people in the refugee camps who might freeze to death without them. And then they've developed a street kids school, so 100 children recently graduated after 3 years of every week coming together and being with the community to support them, to learn their alphabet, to learn their math, to take a weekly course on nonviolence, and to have a community to help them stay away from the trafficking that could eventually pull the girls into prostitution rings and pull the boys into drug rings. It's been a crucial, vital place of education. And the reason their mothers can let them stop foraging around in the marketplace or trying to sell tissues or wash cars for at least half a day is because every month they get a ration of beans and cooking oil and rice. And then they get some warm clothes and book bags. And so that's the kind of surveillance so needed. And it's happening in a city that's so tense, so anxiety-ridden, so dangerous. And this is the way we could be known all around the world, as people who reach out a hand of friendship and fairness. So I'm sort of getting over a cold. I think I'm beyond the contagion stage. So my voice isn't going to be very good for this. But my friend Buddy Bell, some of you would know Buddy Bell, he taught me a song. Tear down those walls, tear down those walls. We want to see people living free. Tear down those walls. Down at Nogales, tear down those walls, and the walls that the Saudis are trying to build to keep people out, and the walls that we're told to build in our own hearts between different groups. You know, you can't love this person, you can't love the... Tear them all down. Not moats, bridges, to reach across those presumed borders, and never, ever let anyone tell us that you can't love another person. So thank you, all of you, for the loving community I know you've fostered here in Boston and beyond. To the walkers, we know that you'll carry a spirit forth that's intensely, vitally needed. And I surely wish each of you the best in your peace work. And if you ever come to Chicago, we finally put in a doorbell. I'm so proud of us.
Kathy, of course, you're not going to get away that easy. We're going to have a question and answer period. But during the question and answer period, I'm going to be circulating some sign-up sheets. Some of you have signed up to join the Raytheon Anti-War campaign, and I'm hoping that more of you will tonight. Basically, it means that we'll be in touch with you as rallies take place, like on April 4th at MIT when Raytheon, we have some of the organizers of this over here on April 4th. A new anti-war group has started at MIT of students for the first time in a long time.
And the BU.
And Chance is working at BU. And so something is happening out there as we realize that the war in Yemen is really not very far away. It's being organized and conducted out of Massachusetts. Raytheon has 9 huge plants here. The bombs that Kathy talked about are made in their plant in Tucson, but they make tons of other materials here that they sell to the Saudis. And of course, that's only the beginning, only the tip of the iceberg. Raytheon is opening up a new subsidiary in Saudi Arabia. It's opening up a new subsidiary in United Arab Emirates. It sees the Middle East and these governments as a future market for itself. And it brags about all this right on its own website. I have the articles here. I won't bore you with going into them. So it's quite an unbelievable situation that a company that is one of the main sponsors of the Walk for Hunger in Boston is at the same time providing the means by which famine can be brought about in Yemen. I hope you'll sign this up. I hope you'll sign up on this sheet that I'm going to distribute now, and ask Kathy to come on back up here, and I know you'll all have questions for her. There you go.
Thank you. Well, questions, comments, criticism, ideas. Thank you for listening to me. I'd be very happy to hear what your thoughts are. And I can bring this microphone too far.
Paul, you got to give a pen with it.
Oh, here, Paul.
People don't have their own pens anymore? Yeah.
No.
Are we all set with the pen over there?
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about the situation in Afghanistan. You mentioned a bit about it. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the threat of civil war and what the situation is there. I'm 27, and for my whole adult life and much of my teenage years, the war has been raging there. For people who are now becoming adults for the first time in this country, it's been a war their whole life. And so there's some discussion of peace talks, but I was hoping you could speak a little bit more as someone with real knowledge of the situation there.
Well, my young friends tell me that they believe that doing the things that would seriously make for peace would involve creating jobs and livelihoods for people. 21 of 34 provinces are hit by drought, which certainly hasn't helped matters. The refugee camp populations are soaring. People's livestock thirst to death and die. They can't raise crops, and so they come to the cities and they move into refugee camps. And the desperation is such that, and this has been true for years, I'm told probably every family, even the ones I know pretty well, have guns. So it's a very, very dangerous situation now. There's the possibility of desperation. There's a weaponized group of people, for instance, living in Kabul, and there are deep divisions between the Tajik, the Pashto, and the Hazara. Has the United States done something to alleviate the harsh poverty in Afghanistan over the years? I want to just at least mention that 4 times a year, the Special Inspector General on Afghanistan report, it's called SIGAR, has been issued to every person in Congress and the Senate, and every time it's issued, it documents with great clarity instance after instance of corruption, fraud, shoddy workmanship, theft, and so I don't think the United States has made much of a difference in any kind of a positive way in Afghanistan. But I think what you'll hear is a kind of a marketing of continued United States military presence in Afghanistan, because what are you going to do for the women and children if the U.S. leaves? Now, I won't tell you that my young friends are pretty nervous about what can happen if the Taliban take over. They're terribly, acutely conscious that the majority of Afghanistan's population are women and children. The women weren't represented at all in the talks at Doha, there were talks that took place also in Moscow, and 2 women were among the 50 people from Afghanistan that were invited to those talks. Forget any kind of representation of the young people. So they are surely nervous, and there are statements that are being made, there has to be representation of other groups. It seems like the United States is mainly wanting to move toward some kind of a deal with the Taliban and has been pretty dismissive of the Afghan government. I see the Afghan government as a combination of warlords. I see the United States as another warlord, the one that's got the most money, the one that's got the most sophisticated weapons, but I don't want to kid myself about the intent and the purpose of the United States' presence there. I deeply hope that it won't move towards civil war, but I'm not encouraged by that statistic about the $123 million worth of bullets that were shipped over there. What would avert civil war, again, if people have a livelihood, if they have an income, if they have a way to feed their family, that is a way to offset the possibilities of chaos. It's also complicated because Afghanistan is one of the largest, if not the largest, exporters of marijuana in the world. And that makes me nervous, because I think as marijuana could even eventually be something that pharmaceutical companies would use as a replacement for acetaminophen, how valuable is that crop going to be? And then warlords are going to say, whoa, we need to hang on to our foothold in this country. It's also a major exporter of opium. So it's a pretty complicated situation. And when you think about the surveillance that's going on in the country constantly, the United States military is pulling in miles and miles of footage every day. It's not just those blimps. There are drones that crisscross the country. There must be plenty of United States awareness of the trafficking of opium and other crops like marijuana. So I would say the prospects are not looking very good right now. When the United States can watch a country move into being a failed narco state, which Afghanistan now is, a failed narco state, and then if it can tumble into even more chaos, which could be caused by civil war, then it's much easier to dominate that kind of a country. So I so admire my young friends in the Afghan peace volunteers. They get all that. They teach it to me. But they are trying their best to live dignified, creative, worthwhile lives. And I feel like we can learn so much from them. I just want to add in this story. When they realized that I and other people at Voices were starting to pay a lot of attention to Yemen, I could sort of sense a bit of anxiety, like, oh, great, our American friends and our British friends are going to be looking at Yemen, and what about us? And I don't know what discussions happened last year during the month of Ramadan, but at the end of that month, they let me know that according to their religion, during Ramadan, they're encouraged to take the money they would have spent on food while they were fasting and water while they were fasting and entrust that to people that are very needy and poor. And so they had collected money for Yemen. And could I help them get that money to Yemen? It was $46.79. Representative of what they would have spent on a bus, and instead they walked. And instead of at the time of sundown, maybe getting dates or bread, they'd forego that. And they saved up what for them was quite a generous offering. Thank you for caring about Afghanistan. Thank you.
Well, this is a broad question, but it's almost impossible in this country to bring up the question of the military. It's almost impossible. It's like a religion. It's like a cult. Last year on Trump's budget, was it $750 billion? 13 Democrats voted against it. And there's no discussion, there's no hint of discussion about the role of the military in this country among the 20, how many candidates are there now? I mean, it's just so frustrating. How can we bring this discussion up?
Well, I think you're right in those first words you said. I used to say, I think the national religion in this country is shopping, but I don't say that anymore. I think the national religion is militarism. And it's been very deliberate. I mean, to those